All right, we are in the book of Psalms, and we're going to start with an introductory lesson. Now, whenever I do a study in a book of the Bible, I always like to take time to do some background study, to get to understand the book, the writers, why it was written, when it was written, who it was written to, and to get that foundational understanding. So we're going to look at that today, and then we're going to talk about meditation, which is a lost art today, and how we can meditate, because that's such an important part of the book of Psalms. And then we'll get into chapter 1 and then continue on through after that. So I want to ask the question, first of all, why? Why do you enjoy reading Psalms? Why is this book a blessing to you? So do we have any comments to share on that?
We do. A couple of ones. A couple people just shared their favorite Psalms. And Sir said he loves Psalm 73. And then, Garrett talks about how he loves how Psalms has incredibly specific prophecies of Jesus, and how that's been such a meaningful part of his own personal walk with the Lord. Don Orstrom shared a quote from J. Vernon McGee that says, "The Psalms record deep devotion, intense feeling, exalted emotion, and dark defection. It is the only book which contains every experience of a human being. The Psalms run the psychological gamut. Every thought, every impulse, every emotion that sweeps over the soul is recorded in the book."
What a great comment. What a great quote from the commentary. And that's one of the things I would encourage you to do, is to get a good commentary on the book of Psalms and to utilize that in this study. McGee is a good one on that. Another one is this one called Exploring the Psalms. It's actually 2 volumes, not one. I just took one in here by Phillips, and a great study through the book of Psalms, John Phillips, and I've really enjoyed that. It's kind of a devotional booklet. And then there's another one by Spurgeon, The Treasury of David, and again, it's 2 volumes in this book, but it's a great devotional study on Psalms. Yeah. You could do it in comparison with that.
Commentaries are excellent study resources. A couple things to keep in mind with them. Number one, there are essentially 2 types of commentaries. They're a more devotional style commentary.
Right.
It's not going to be doing the deep dive into all the interconnections between, like, as Garrett mentioned, between the Psalms and like the New Testament prophecies that fulfill them. It's much more devotional in nature. And then there's one that's going to be, if you will, more theological, more systematic in nature, where it's just going to start showing, the connections that those Psalms, both are good. I would not sacrifice one over the other.
Right.
The second thing is, don't do just one commentary.
Right.
There's an incredible danger in that, because then you're just getting one man's point of view on that, and if you open a second commentary, you might get a completely contradictory point of view. And so you utilize multiple resources, and there's so much available
Especially if you're doing
online.
it from a theological point of view.
Yes,
if you're doing it from a devotional point of view, somebody like Spurgeon can be good. These commentaries I mentioned, somebody like McGee, he's kind of a devotional, but he brings a little bit of depth into it, but he's still devotional. There's other ones that are out there as well. And so I agree. You want to be careful if you're doing a study that you have multiple commentaries you're going to go to. But if the commentary is more devotional, it's okay to do it one. And there are some that have different people do different Psalms. Spurgeon is probably the best known on Psalms. He really did a very extensive study. Now, he's a couple hundred years old. He's been a while since he wrote. But he's very, very good in that way. And Phillips is another one. These are older Psalms studies, and these men have long passed away, but they're still very, very good. And so there's other ones like that. So again, it's what you're looking for. If you're looking for commentary for theological understanding, you need to get a little more variety in there and that way. But if you're looking for a devotional, it's okay to use one guy in that way. All right? All right, any other comments about that?
Cassandra mentioned that she loves Psalm 73 and 103. She says when she's struggling or in need of encouragement, those are 2 that she goes to specifically. Psalm 73 reminds me of who I am, and Psalm 103 reminds me of who God is.
Right.
And then
and that's the thing about Psalms. There's certain Psalms that are very, very well known. Psalm 1, very well known. Blessed is the man. Psalm 23, Psalm 53, Psalms 100, and then Psalms 119. So certain Psalms that are go-to Psalms are very well known. There's other ones that are not as well known, and yet they have such psychological, emotional depth to them.
Peter says how he loves how the Psalms praise and exalt the Lord. And then Diane says Psalms are encouraging. David often begins the psalm telling God about his troubles, and then he reminds himself of who God is, and he ends rejoicing because he's moved his focus from self to God.
Psalms is full of all kinds of questions, and sometimes answers, sometimes not. and that's part of the process of it.
I'll say this, one of the reasons I love the Psalms is as, number one, there's that musical relationship that it has, but like that quote from J. Vernon McGee earlier, it does run the gamut of emotions, and it reminds me that emotions are real, that emotions are raw, and emotions are not pointless in worship, as we sometimes are told.
Right.
They're a part of our worship, and they can bring us into a more full, complete worship that I believe God desires for us. And something that I realized even more recently is I kind of was shying away from songs that were much more from like a personal perspective. I was reading through Psalms, and I realized the vast majority of what David writes is very personal.
Right.
It's from his perspective. It's about him and his relationship
and
to God, and his crying out.
Like you said, it runs the gamut of emotion from anger to depression to joy to just all the different ones there. Okay. The title in Hebrew of Psalms, the title means praise or book of praise. So that's what the word Psalms means. From the Hebrew language. And who are the known writers of Psalms? Now, we obviously think of the first one is David. We think of David as being the writer of Psalms. And he wrote, best we can tell, 73 of the Psalms. Is how many he wrote. If you want to jot that down in your notes, you can. And then Solomon, who wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, wrote, as far as we know, 2 of the Psalms. And then the third writer that we know of is Asaph, A-S-A-P-H. And he wrote 12 Psalms that we know of. And Asaph was the minister of music in the temple during David's time. So he had kind of Caleb's job as the minister of music. He wrote these Psalms. And were probably hymns that he wrote, very, very much so. Where not all the others are hymns. We talk about the Psalms being the hymn book of the nation of Israel, but they weren't all hymns. They weren't all intended to be sung, but the Asaphs probably were. And then an interesting one to me is 12 of the Psalms were written by the sons of Korah. Now, the sons of Korah, if you remember, Korah is the one that stood against Moses in Numbers chapter 16. And God ended up judging him. In fact, let me read from you from Numbers chapter 26 and verse 10. It says, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up together with Korah when that company died, what time the fire devoured 250 men, and they became a sign. So Korah was the leader of 250 men who opposed Moses, and God brought down judgment on them. But interesting, listen to verse 11 now. Notwithstanding, the children of Korah died not. And now we see the sons of Korah. Now that may be the direct children, or it may be the grand or great-grandchildren of Korah. But the sons of Korah wrote 12 of the Psalms. I thought that was really interesting to realize that. Here's a guy that rebelled against God, but his children were used of God to write 12 of the Psalms. And when you read those Psalms, the main theme was 2 things: gratitude and humility. And that's right. They were grateful. God did not judge us for our father's sin. And the humility, realizing that my dad rebelled against God, but God is graceful, and now I can be used of God to write these Psalms. And so I thought that was just very, very interesting in that way. One of the Psalms is attributed to Moses, and that's Psalms chapter 90, and it seems to be a prayer of Moses. And then the rest of about 50 of them were anonymous or other people, kind of miscellaneous other people that we won't name here. But some of them were anonymous, so they may have been by David, they may have been by Solomon. We just don't know who wrote them. And so that's kind of a breakdown. And so I think it's interesting when you read the Psalms, try to understand who wrote the Psalms. Because it's going to be different if David wrote it compared to Solomon, or if the sons of Korah wrote it compared to Asaph. And so that, I think, is going to help you to understand it in a different perspective. Number 3 there, the book of Psalms is a book of 3 things. It's a book of poetry. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not a big fan of poetry in my life. I had a lot of English teachers try to get me to love poetry, and I never really became a fan of poetry. I hate trying to write things, trying to get them to match up in either tone or word sounds or whatever. But yet there's so much depth in poetry, and there's so much beauty in poetry. And so even though you may not be a lover of poetry like some people are, there's a lot there that can really give you a blessing. And so don't write it off just because it's poetry. And then many of the Psalms are written as prayers. And in fact, a good majority of them, I would say, were probably written as prayers, just talking to God. And then many of them, of course, were hymns, and were meant to be sung by the choir or to be sung by the congregation or a combination of both. And so it's good when you're reading the psalm, is this a prayer? Is this meant as poetry? Is this meant as a hymn? And many hymns are poetry written to music, but they can be different as well. Now, Psalms also uses 4 different literary styles. It uses something called parallelism, repetition, development, and contrast. Now, do you know what parallelism is? Do you know what any of these are? So, Caleb, what do you think? Do you have, what is your thoughts on those? I know it's not time for people to comment, so I'm going to put you on the spot. So we have parallelism, repetition, development, and contrast. So give me a thought on 1 or 2 of those.
Well, I was going to say, first of all, this really hooks back into the idea of poetry. As you read through Psalms, sometimes it's hard to see it. While we do understand that there's an intrinsic beauty going on there, and there is something beautiful about the way, especially in the King James, about the way that they're written.
Yes.
One of the cool things about the King James translators is they actually consulted poets of the day in the translation
right.
of these sections to help, and that they consulted with these poets to help make sure that they flowed, at least in English, as well as they would in Hebrew.
Right, because
and that doesn't always transfer.
Yeah, rhymes don't transfer from one language to another, or
Hebrew
meter was more meter basis. And
well, Hebrew poetry doesn't handle things like that the same way
right.
as English does,
yeah.
and it's a much different way. So parallelism is one of the ways that they did, was how poetry worked, and parallelism would be the idea of parallel thoughts were poetic in nature, right? So you see a lot of the Psalms where David is developing a thought about God being his protection, right? He'll use his words like shield, buckler, my fortress, my strong tower, right?
Right.
And so you see those phrases, and a lot of Bibles will actually have those laid out in parallel phrases. So if you ever look at your Bible and you wonder, why is there a line break right there? A lot of times what they're doing, especially if you're on a digital Bible, like on your phone or something, is they're trying to show you the breakdown of that parallelism.
And parallelism, I like it because, of course, I like object lessons and using a parallelism in my sermons a lot of times, and comparing this with that. And it sometimes compares actual objects, and sometimes it'll compare more of a feeling or a thought in parallelism, okay?
Yep.
And then repetition is used quite extensively.
Well, all throughout different Psalms, you have different phrases that are repeated between different Psalms.
Right.
One of the ones that I think of it right off the top of my head is His mercy endureth forever. That's one that repeats throughout multiple Psalms. And then when you hit Psalm 136, it repeats a bunch of times, a whole lot of times in Psalm 136, a couple times in Psalm 118 as well.
And even in Psalm 119, which is that long one, you'll see that same phrase, like a heart for God, used again and again and again throughout that psalm. And then development is the idea of developing a thought through the psalm, to start here and take it then over here and develop it out.
A good example of this would be Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God,
Right.
the firmament, right? And he develops that thought of where the
Psalms
glory
139 is another one, the same thing. So, good. And then contrast. So
contrast, we go back to parallelism.
Right.
It'd be almost the opposite of that. Parallelism is showing similarities, whereas contrast is another form of Hebrew poetry where it gives a line with one thought and then it gives a complete opposite thought on the next.
Exact opposite, exactly. And then there's some, the type of poetry, the type of writing they use would be acrostic, which is the idea of just using the words, or like Psalms 119 is one that uses the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet in writing it out. And some other ones would use something along that line. Alliteration was used quite a bit. We don't see it so much in the English, but it was used in the Hebrew, where they would alliterate. A lot of preachers like to alliterate their message, where everything starts with the same letter or the same sound, or the same, at least the same idea.
Yeah. I do want to highlight why it's important, these last two, Roman numeral 3, Roman numeral 4 here. They're very important because they dictate to us how we're going to approach these.
Right.
We believe the Bible is true. We believe all of the Bible is equally true. But we cannot approach all of the Bible the same exact way, because we're going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble if we do so. I mean, you read through some of these things and you have to understand. Well, first you have to make a determination. It's not even starting with an understanding. You have to make a determination of, is this poetry?
Right. Because it's something we'll talk about poetic license. in that how we're using poetic license. We know what we're saying isn't absolutely true, but it's poetically true, and it's comparing, you know, and my wife to something poetically that's not. She's not the sunshine. She's not the sun, but she's the sunlight to me.
Yeah. Or for instance, David talked about his bed being on the waves of the sea.
Yeah.
Well, no, his bed wasn't literally
he didn't have
floating in the sea. He was talking about
right.
how he was tossing and turning the whole night.
Yeah.
There is a poetic aspect there.
Exactly.
It's going to change how we interpret what he's trying to say to us.
And
so
that's why this is so important. You're exactly right. And then they will also use anthropomorphism, which is just basically giving. It's the idea of giving to God certain characteristics of man, where we know God doesn't have a hand in the sense that we do. He's a spirit, and they worship him as spirit and truth, but talks about the hand of God. And so it gives God man's physical features and physical things, and God's anger is not like my anger, and so on down the line. So these are all used in there. So again, and there's other ones as well, but these are some of the primary ones. Is not a lot of, you know, with our poetry, we tend to think of it being rhyming, and there wasn't a lot of that done in the Hebrew language. They would, and you think of like Japanese poetry as the haiku, and you know, and just the different things there, and so it's a different style of poetry that we need to understand. Okay. Psalms covers a period of how long? I'll come back to that because I'm going to give you a chance to answer that, see if you know. How many years from the first psalm that we know of that was written and the last psalm that was written, about how many years would you say is covered during that time period? And we'll come back to that. But let's also talk about the types of psalms. What types are there? There's different types of psalms, and I think Garrett alluded to one of those in his comment earlier on. And so I'd like to have, you know, what are some different types of psalms? What kind of label or characteristic would you give to that psalm? So I have about 7 of them listed here. Doesn't mean that's all of them, but there's certain types that we can identify in doing that.
The Haskins both and Don Nordstrom already got the years, 1,000 years, about 1,000 years.
About 1,000 years. We believe probably the first one was Moses, as far as we know, on through after David's time, even Solomon. And so about 1,000-year period is the Psalms, the time period.
Do you want some of the answers that are coming
sure,
in for you
types of Psalms.
Yeah, so types of Psalms, we have, Tim says lament. Brett says worship.
Okay.
We have confidence, thanksgiving, messianic, Psalms of praise. That's all I'm seeing so far.
Okay. All right. So letter A is a lament of the individual community, just saying, why is this happening? Why are we suffering? Why the wicked seem to prosper? Why, you know, and it's a lament. Psalms 3 and Psalms 44 examples of that. If you want to go look at some examples, we won't do that right now. But they're laments of the individual. David quite often said, why God, why God, why God, why God? And he didn't get an answer to most of those questions. God just said, you know what? You're going to be the winner in the end. Don't worry about it. And then there's thanksgiving or praise. That's a big part of Psalms, is Psalms of thanksgiving, Psalms of praise. Also, we mentioned worship. Psalms 30, Psalms 100 is probably one of the better known ones. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all you lands. And then C is Psalms of trust. Again, David had to come back to that. He started out with lament, but this said, but God, I trust you. I trust you. I trust you. Psalms 4 is a good example of that. The royal Psalms, like Garrett alluded to, many of the Psalms are written about Christ. They're prophecies. Psalms 2 is the first royal Psalm. Psalms 20, Psalm 72. And then there's wisdom psalms. They're kind of like the Proverbs in the book of Psalms. They're written to give us wisdom. Psalms chapter 1, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. Psalms 37. Psalms 119 is kind of like Proverbs. The verses don't necessarily relate with one another directly. It's like he just throws in a bunch of different thoughts and gives you a lot of wisdom in a long chapter there. Messianic psalms. More of the royal Psalms, actually going back to more talking about Jesus as the king, as the ruler. Messianic Psalms talked about more in the sense of the Messiah is coming. Psalms 2, Psalms 110, And then imprecatory psalms, I-M-P-R-E-C-A-T-O-R-Y, if you want to spell it right. These are psalms where David calls down for the judgment of God on someone or some group. They're imprecatory psalms. And he just says, God, look at these people, what they're doing. You need to judge them, and asking God to judge them for their sin and doing that. And so those are some of the categories.
I do want to get this in before I forget. We have a book of Psalms, plural, but you have Psalm 1, singular.
Yeah.
Similar to Revelation. It's a book of Revelations, but it has a revelation.
Yeah.
Each individual.
Yeah,
so
I
it's a
tend
book
to
of
say,
Psalms.
I tend to always put the S on there.
It's a habit thing.
And doing that, but yes.
If you want to be technically correct, that's how.
Yeah. Okay. Number 7 there is the Psalms are arranged in 5 books or divisions. Now, these are not necessarily biblical in the sense that the Bible set this up. It's how we've kind of set it up to kind of break it down into more bite size. I always like to break things down a little bit to help me to get I can't handle something this big. And so if I bring it down, something that's more bite size, it helps me in that way. So 116 of the Psalms have titles that are biblical. In my Bible, the Ryrie, I have a Ryrie Study Bible, he breaks it down and kind of outlines the books of the Bible, and he puts titles in each outline. And those are from Ryrie. They're not inspired of God. They're not part of the original. He put them in there. But in the Psalms, when you read a title in the book of Psalms, that is part of the original, even though it doesn't have a verse number by it. And so 116, not all of them, but 116 of them have Psalms, or have titles. And it's basically these divisions: chapters 1 through 41, chapters 42 through 72, chapters 73 through 89, 90 through 106, and 107 through 150. Now, as I looked this up, why did they divide them that way? And I'll read those again in just a moment. There's a lot of different reasons why, but it's not technical. I don't want to get into that in the study, but you can look them up. But it just kind of helps you break it down. 1 to 41, 42 through 72, 73 through 89, 90 through 106, and 107 through 150. That's kind of the breakdown that most Bible scholars kind of break it up into smaller chunks in. What 2 musical notations are used extensively in the Psalms? Because it is a music book. Many of them are hymns or songs of praise. The one is to the chief musician. That phrase is used 55 times. And it was probably that, when you see that phrase, it's usually in the title, sometimes in the verses. That means that was written, and whoever wrote it said, I'm giving this to chief. I wrote a hymn. I want you guys to sing this. Is basically what it comes down to. So it'd be like if you wrote a song and came to say Caleb and said, can we sing this in church? That's the idea of that title in there. And so that identifies it as a hymn. The second term, does anybody know what that is? See if you can come up with that one and looking at that. Now, while they're coming up, there's another term that's used and it's kind of a musical notation as far as we can tell. And so see if they can come up with that. Looking at number 9, while you're getting that answer in, of 283 New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, how many of those 283, the New Testament, they quote as, again, there's a lot of times they allude to the Old Testament, but these are quotes where we can tell they're actually trying to quote something from the Old Testament. How many times does it come from the book of Psalms? See if you can come up with that number and comment on that. And then we're going to look at just the other 2 things there before we finish up is what's the longest chapter, what's the shortest chapter, what's the middle chapter of the Bible, and the middle verse of the Bible in the book of Psalms. And then we'll end with talking about some of the main ideas or themes, which is different than what we talked about earlier on. These are types. So I wanted to go over some of the themes of the book of Psalms in different chapters in there. Okay, so anybody come up with the musical term?
Yes, so we had Sherry, she said stringed instrument.
Okay, they would often say about using stringed instruments.
To the chief musician, on my stringed instrument.
Right. It was meant, and he meant that they wanted to use instruments with that in some way or another, and there's significance to that.
And then Ellie and Don Nordstrom's both said Selah.
Selah. And that is it's used 71 times in the Psalms. And we don't know for sure exactly what that means. We don't have any historical evidence to go back and get the full understanding of that term.
I think it's important to highlight that we don't know very much about the music in the Bible.
No.
We at best know the words of some of the songs, and if we're being honest, this is probably a very small cross section of the entirety of their cultural song.
Right, and the fact, for example, you said stringed instruments. You put that in there. Does that mean that a lot of times they didn't sing? They sang without instruments, and did they, like the chanting style, or was it more of a choir style? Was it congregational style? Was it individuals? Those are some of the questions we have.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to point out. Those are some of the basic things that we do know. We know that they used instruments.
Right.
We don't know how often and what situations. We do know that they use instruments. We know a lot of the instruments that they used. As you read through, if you just do a quick search on instruments in the Bible, you see things from things more like trumpets and even like the precursor to the trombone. If you is one of those, you see things like stringed instruments like a harp, or even an instrument that's kind of a precursor to a guitar. You see things like, you see Miriam using the timbrel, or what would be similar to like a tambourine. You see drums. You see, I mean, there's just this massive, they even have ones that they refer to as an organ, though it would not be what we would consider an organ. There's a massive range. And then we also know that they did use skilled musicians. They talk about that a lot.
And
so
there was a choir.
There was a very organized element to it. But a lot of that was intertwined with their culture specifically, and their culture kind of dictated what that looked like. And that's why I think you see a lot less description of that in the New Testament, especially.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And sometimes we make assumptions. We think of them like singing like our choir or our hymns.
Probably was nothing like, we're being honest.
And we make assumptions. And even the Bible talks about dancing. And we think of dancing and going to the bar and doing a slow dance or doing a fast dance or something like that. But it was dancing in the Bible was more of like a celebration. It was more of, like almost like marching or celebration or lifting up your hands. Those are all things that we're not used to in our culture. And there is a cultural aspect to music, but there's also
in our Western culture.
In our Western culture. There's a cultural aspect to music, but there's also a biblical aspect, and we can't just say, well, this is the way the Bible says we're supposed to do it, because that may have been part of their culture and not necessarily a biblical mandate. But at the same time, why did he say stringed instruments? Well, obviously he's saying, I want the instruments used in this situation, so maybe they didn't normally do that. And so we just don't know enough to really say for sure. And we have to be careful of that. Now, with the term Selah, as best as we can tell, I like how one preacher put it. He defined it as this. It means think of that. It was like meant as an interlude or a pause. And it's like when a choir's singing, then they stop, and then they start singing again. It gets your attention, and so when you see that word Selah in the Psalms, it's probably saying, hey, you just read something important. Don't just rush through it. Think about it. Think about what you just read. Think about what just was said here, and that's the idea of the word Selah, as best as we can tell. And so when you read the word Selah, what I do when I read it is I stop. And I go back and read what I just read, because I'm supposed to think about it. And so I try to meditate, think about it a little bit, really take a moment to really pay attention to that. So that's as best as we can tell what that word means. All right, of 283 New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, how many are from the book of Psalms? Anybody know that?
Yeah, Kim said over 100.
Okay, over 100. That's good.
I didn't realize we didn't do that blanket, so I already put that in the comments.
Oh, okay. It's actually 116, again, as best we can tell. New Testament, they didn't use quotation marks, so we don't always know when they were intending to quote. And a lot of times the quote, if you read it in the New Testament, go back and read in the Old Testament, they're not exactly the same. And the reason is because you're going from Hebrew to Greek quite often, and so you got a translated quote. And sometimes I've done this where I've not intended to quote the verse exactly, but I'm just giving you the basics of the verse. And so again, we're not 100% okay, this is exact, but 116 of them seem to be from the book of Psalms, which is quite a few out of 283. So that's a good number coming from Psalms. Luke 24 and verse number 44, Luke 24:44, It says, and he said unto them, these are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, and the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me. So Psalms was kind of like its own group. You have the law of Moses, the first 5 books. You have the prophets, but then you have Psalms. And so there's a lot of quotes that are coming from the book of Psalms. And then Psalms, what's the longest chapter in the book of Psalms? Anybody give that one in there?
Longest, nobody said that yet, but I think
Okay.
everyone knows.
119.
Yeah, Psalm
that's,
119.
That's the one, the longest one in the book of Psalms. What's the shortest?
Garrett said Psalm 117 is the middle.
It's also the shortest. It is the shortest, and it's the middle chapter of the whole Bible. Not the middle chapter of Psalms, but the middle chapter of the whole Bible. Anybody know what the middle verse is in the whole Bible?
I haven't seen anyone put that one up yet.
What I want to figure out is who's the guy that counted them? You know, counted every verse all the way through the Bible and figure out what the middle is. I'm not that mathematician. I'm not the one that would do that, but somebody did do it. And so anybody got that down?
Ensner cheated and said Psalm 118:8.
All right. How'd you know that, Ensner? Psalms 119 and verse number 8, which says, I will keep thy statutes, O forsake me not. I'm sorry, 118 and verse number 8, I'm sorry. It is better to trust in the Lord than put confidence in men. What a great center verse in the Bible. Now remember, the verse breakdowns were added way after the Bible was written. They're not in the original. They were added to help us locate where we're going in the Bible. But I still think that's amazing that that's what the center verse came out to be. That just seems to be of the Lord, and that's a blessing. Okay, so what are some main ideas or themes of the book of Psalms, of individual Psalms? Give me some themes or ideas that were there. Anybody come up with any yet?
Not quite yet. While we're waiting for that, I'll say this about, you were talking about the quotations in the New Testament. It definitely is important to look, to realize that, we're going through multiple translations at this point, because not only have you gone from Hebrew to Greek, then also from Greek to English. So remember that specifically. Yeah. Also, realize that a lot of these writers, they were well versed in the Hebrew scriptures. Mm-hmm. And so when they make allusions, when they allude in their writing to some of these Old Testament passages, especially the Psalms, they know them so well, they're picking up on allusions that we aren't. And so right. I would definitely challenge people to take some time to specifically go look up Old Testament quotations in the New Testament.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Go look it up in context, look up the scripture there.
It is huge.
That is a real big thing. And remember, too, the hearers were better versed than we are. They didn't have a Bible to read, so they had to know a lot of it by memory. Yeah. And so, and I don't know about you, but when I quote a verse by memory, I don't always get it right. And so I'm not saying that they were wrong. God inspired his word, but at the same time, when he's talking to the audience out there and they're given a verse, they know exactly what he's talking about. Where a lot of times I quote a verse to people in the church and they have, well, I don't know what that is. I've never read that, And there was a lot more knowledge of the Bible for that Jewish believer,
And then one other interesting, as you're looking up Old Testament, before we get to the themes that they're sharing here, as you're looking up Old Testament quotations in the New Testament, you'll find that sometimes in the New Testament, God actually redefines the meaning when he quotes the Old Testament. So what like a prophet would have said in the Old Testament and would have been understood to have meant, God says, but actually it meant this.
Well, it's like,
about that with
it's like talking about David, not suffer your body. And everybody thought that was David.
Yeah.
But then he said, no, that's Jesus. And we're not talking about David here. We're talking about Jesus. Yeah. And so there's a lot of that there. Okay.
So a couple of themes that are being shared here. Anticipating the coming Messiah.
Okay.
Ultimate destinations and different paths that we can take. Worship and adoration. Sherry said specifically about Psalm 1, superiority of godliness. And then also we have adoration, the adoration of Israel, God's protection. So those are some of those that were shared.
All right. I'm going to share some I have. Then the last thing I want to ask for the comments online is tell me choose one chapter in Psalms that's your favorite. Comment on that. Here's one of my favorites. Again, hard to do. It's like saying who's my favorite kid. And I won't mention which one's my favorite right now. But it's hard to choose which one is. But what would be a favorite Psalm that you have? One that's maybe just meant a lot to you right now.
Yeah.
And it's not your all-time favorite, but it's right now. So we'll let you throw some of those in there and just a brief why. And then we'll close out with that. I put down as themes trust. Boy, that's a big theme in the book of Psalms, is trust. God, I trust you. I trust you. David, over and over again, said, God, I don't understand. I don't know why this is happening, but I trust you. But I trust you. Praise. Again and again and again, just praising God, not for what he does, but for who he is. Rejoicing. A lot of the Psalms are, man, just rejoice. Mercy. Thanking God for his mercy. And you go on and on. Psychologically, so much. You go into depression, read the book of Psalms. Sometimes some of the Psalms will depress you, almost. But then at the end of them, you come back and say, but you know what? God is still God and God is still good. And if you need encouragement, if you need, it's just a great book in that way, and such a variety that we get out of there. Okay, notice, by the way, we finished up a section on this. We're going to really try to move a little faster through Psalms than we did the book of James. Next week, we're going to talk about meditation, because you can't understand Psalms if you don't know how to meditate. It's a lost art today, and we've got to learn how to do it. And some people comes somewhat naturally. Other people, it's a learned art. And so you got to learn how to meditate. Some Psalms to close out with, though.
Well, I want to make one comment real quick before I start reading some of these, give it a little more time, because right now we only have 2. But you mentioned how we praise, one of the themes is praise, not for what he does, but for who he is. That's such an important posture of worship. If we come to worship only to worship God for what he has done, we're missing out on what worship truly is. Because worship is a humility of our own heart, realizing who God is, and especially who we are compared to him.
And again, David,
and then we also forget that everything he does flows out of who he is.
Yes. Yeah, and David again and again and again had to do that. Said, I don't understand, but you're still God and you're still good. And then he would list out the attributes of God, and really seeing that. Okay.
Okay, so we have, Don says Psalm 91, protection is one of my favorite. Brett says the same thing, Psalm 91. Garrett says Psalm 34. It has had a large impact on my life, along with the whole Bible. Thank you, Garrett. Gavin says Psalm 119. Ensner says Psalm 73, and specifically verses 38 and 39. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away, and he did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again.
Okay. And what you'll be surprised at, too, as we go through, how many of the thoughts from Psalm are part of our vernacular today, and people don't even know. Now, like Psalms 93, everybody knows. Psalms 23, I mean, everybody knows that one. Yeah. It's used at funerals and different times. But there's so many things in Psalms that are phrases we use today, but they come from the book of Psalms. Yeah. And that's going to be interesting to see as well.
Sherry says Psalm 1, and Jen says Psalm 119.
Okay. All right. So we'll go through those. If there's a specific psalm you want us to cover in a study, you can email me and let me know that. I can't promise it. We just can't cover them all. But we're going to go through Psalm 1 will be the first one, so you can start studying that and meditating upon that. And again, find yourself maybe a good devotional booklet or something and helping you with that. But hope you've enjoyed this study tonight. This preliminary study excites me because it really gets me, oh, wow, this can be interesting. And I hope it's going to be interesting for you as well. Invite others to join us. And as we're starting out a brand new study, it's a great opportunity to jump in here and to be a part of that as well.